Today, with the help of a Steve Shives video on the subject of snowflakes, we are going to be talking about what he deems to be free speech champions and what I deem to be pro-censorship muppets. Now, I have covered this subject before with Steve Shives, in fact, where he talked about free speech and censorship and node platforming, which we're going to talk about again because why not? Now, for those that are new to my channel or have never heard of Steve Shives, Steve was once a respected atheist. Something happened, and he was no longer a respected atheist, something to do with Atheism Plus, and some poison Kool-Aid. Some would blame it on his wife, which is quite common. You see it online quite a lot. I've seen it with some very interesting people I would certainly have considered friend at one point, where quite a number may assume it has something to do with the girlfriend or the boyfriend. I don't care who's to blame. If you drunk from the poison Kool-Aid, good luck to you. But there's a chance you can recover, eventually. I do believe I've gotten off topic. So let's just dive right in.
There's an excellent op-ed published today in the New York Times. This is it right here. It's called What Snowflakes Get Right About Free Speech, and it's by Ulrich Baer.
In the description below, I have linked that very article that Steve has referenced. We are going to go through a part of it now because I think it's relevant to the whole snowflake thing that he's going to talk about. During the 1980s and 90s, a shift occurred in American culture. Personal experience and testimony, especially of suffering and oppression, began to challenge the primacy of argument. Freedom of expression became a flashpoint in this shift. Then as now, both liberals and conservatives were wary of the privileging of personal experience with its powerful emotional impact over reason and argument, which some fear will bring an end to civilization or at least to freedom of speech. Now, I personally believe that evidence trumps all. Personal experience is a form of evidence, but an individual's experience may not be enough to convey a totally truthful point. This statement is supported by the comment Landsman made earlier, "Madam, you are an experience but not an argument," where he spent 5 years making a 10-hour film about 4 parts of the extermination of the Jews, and a lady conveyed a point that her experience was not fully conveyed in the film. The recent student demonstrations at Auburn against Spencer's visit, as well as protests on other campuses against Charles Murray, Milo Yiannopoulos, and others, should be understood as an attempt to understand the conditions of free speech for a greater group of people rather than censorship. Liberal free speech advocates rush to point out that the views of these individuals must be heard to be rejected, but this is not the case. Universities invite speakers not chiefly to present otherwise unavailable discoveries, but to present the public views they have presented elsewhere. When those views invalidate the humanity of some people, they restrict speech as a public good. In such cases, there is no inherent value to be gained from debating them in public. In today's age, we also have simple solution that should appease all those concerned that students are insufficiently exposed to controversial views. It is called the internet, where all kinds of offensive expression flourish, unfettered on a vast platform available to nearly all. The greater value and importance of freedom of expression for higher education and for democracy is hard to overestimate, but it has been regrettably easy for commenters to create a simple dichotomy between the younger generation's oversensitivity and a freedom and free speech as an absolute good that leads to the truth. We would do better to focus on a more sophisticated understanding, such as the one provided by Lyotard, of the necessary conditions for speech to be a common public good. This requires the realization that in politics the parameters of public speech must be continually redrawn to accommodate those who previously had no standing. To support this, you introduce a philosopher called Jean-François Lyotard and his analysis in the postmodern condition. There is a small problem with his work in that his early work doesn't quite line up with his later work that people like Deleuze consider to be a form of nihilism. I am going to link a few things below if you're incredibly bored. By all means read them, as they support the claim of nihilism and some postmodern stuff on when modernity truly ended, which is all rather nice. Oh, and for those wondering, this is all relevant as Lyotard is not big on rehashing arguments, which for a philosopher is very interesting.
In the piece, Ulrich Baer describes how these student protesters who have come out to stand against speakers such as Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer in recent weeks and months at college campuses across the United States.
It does make me somewhat chuckle a little when I hear you say stand up and protest when the word violent seems to have skipped you entirely.
These students who have often been attacked and vilified by people on the right.
And criticized by people on the right, the left, and in the center. Mostly for being delicate little teacups that get remarkably violent when triggered or agitated even slightly.
As being anti-free speech or putting their own feelings and their own sensitivities ahead of stalwart principles of the Republic, like free speech, are snowflakes.
Well, they are the ones pushing to have people stopped from speaking. Now, I'm not saying people on the other side wouldn't do the same thing. I'm sure if given the opportunity they would. But as I'm somebody that firmly believes in free speech for all, and I've been pretty consistent for the last 2 years on YouTube on that, it seems to me from what I've noticed that when people don't like to hear something different, they act out in violent ways, in some vain attempt to get what they want, which seems redundant because they're the ones using the very free speech to stop others from speaking because they don't want people to talk about it. And by it I mean something they disagree with. Although I'm sure for the most part we could probably agree that what they say is not exactly favourable. But it must be said anyway, because free speech.
And they just need to be silenced or shamed into going back to their dorms and studying instead of going out and hitting the streets and protesting people like Spencer or Yiannopoulos.
I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this, but I don't care how someone feels when somebody criticises them. If they feel shamed, that is something to do with them. That is their own problem. If they wish to use mob mentality to its fullest strength, they need to shelve that shame, for whatever reason the shame has manifested, and instead join in that peaceful protest. Super peaceful protest.
Bear argues really persuasively and really articulately that it is actually those folks, the so-called snowflakes, who are the true champions of free speech.
Oh, I can see so many anti-SGW friends getting very irritated to hear that. I'm sure there are quite a number of response videos where people get very wound up over the idea of anti-free speech people, or those that wish to protect free speech through this lens where any speech that is considered bad must be stopped, are champions of free speech because they're protecting it from the other side of the argument, or people who hold different political values, who may well themselves, if pushed or far enough, like that funny little horseshoe, would do exactly the same thing to people on the, I guess left, right. Oh, political leanings. They do my head in. Why can't we just live by the rules of right and wrong? Never mind. Please continue. I'm not going to get triggered over that one little statement, because for all I know, they may well be the true World Wrestling Federation champions of free speech.
Not the apologists and the defenders of Spencer and Yiannopoulos and all of the other assorted deplorable people, the hate mongers and purveyors of ignorance and intolerance who have for some reason been granted platforms on college campuses with alarming frequency over the last few years.
I don't quite understand how you anti-free speech champions have such an issue with a college inviting somebody that is controversial to speak on their campus. That person drums up interest, publicity, and generates money, which is the whole point. Yes, they are pushing ideas you may not like, you with your particular political leanings may not like. But they're still allowed to speak. I believe they should be allowed to. I believed it 11 years ago when Nick Griffin was invited to speak on my university campus, and I believe it now when people like Richard Spencer want to speak. I actually have a little bit of a challenge for you, Mr. Shives. You may not like what these people have to say, but to say that means you have listened to them already. When one of them speaks near to where you are, wherever that may be, go see them actually speak, and if they offer opportunity to ask questions, ask them anything you want, and record it for everyone to see, and wear your anti-Nazi pin.
And in this piece, Bear covers a lot of really interesting ground. He talks about the limited value of debates in situations like this. He talks about the idea that there are certain topics that really shouldn't be held up for public debate, that universities shouldn't feel a responsibility to host debates over. If there is a proposed debate or a proposed sort of implied debate,
there is no subject that shouldn't be held up for public debate. We should be allowed to talk about anything, debate anything, and colleges are free to do whatever they want. If they are publicly funded, then I'm sure governments can enforce certain restrictions, if they so choose to. But if they are privately owned, they can do whatever they want as long as they abide certain academic standards. As earlier mentioned, Bear is drawing inspiration from someone whose later works were regarded by many other philosophers as a bit nihilist. And as an added thing, I do recall there being many people who felt that Brexit, although completely off topic, should never have gone to the public vote. It shouldn't have been up for public discussion. But do you know why it was? Because the political shift to the right and the sheer number, the volume of people that voted a certain way forced the government's hand. Mob mentality for the win, I guess.
Which is often the excuse used when awful people like Spencer and Yiannopoulos and others of their ilk are invited to speak at college campuses. The excuse made by people who, even by people who claim not to want to defend their ideology, they say, well, we need to hear them out because their ideas need to be heard in order to be argued about and rejected.
It's not that their ideas need to be heard. It's that they are allowed to speak. What these idiots have to say is irrelevant. The very fact that they want to say it and the college has invited them to speak is. The subject is irrelevant.
Bear makes the point that in most cases, people like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos have nothing new to say and will not be informing anyone in the audience about their views or telling anyone anything that they haven't heard already.
Ooh, words spoken by somebody on any particular political leaning that is nothing more than a salty bitch that can't stand the idea of somebody with an extreme opposing idea to their own speaking in a public place.
You are merely, by giving them an audience, by giving them a platform, you are merely enabling them and allowing them to perpetuate their hatred and their intolerance and propagate their twisted and in many cases harmful and dangerous ideology.
I'm not going to repeat what I just said, but I can see a lot of people finding that particular quote to be quite easy to turn again towards any particular political side.
I've linked to the piece in the description box of this video. I urge all of you to go read it. But there is one particular passage that I want to share with you. Ulrich Bear says, quote, "The idea of freedom of speech does not mean a blanket permission to say anything anybody thinks. It means balancing the inherent value of a given view with the obligation to ensure that other members of a given community can participate in discourse as fully recognized members of that community. Free speech protections, not only but especially in universities, which aim to educate students in how to belong to various communities, should not mean that someone's humanity or their right to participate in political speech as political agents can be freely attacked, demeaned, or questioned."
And I disagree with Ulrich Bear. It's not about words having value or opinions having value. It is simply everyone gets to speak. The university is not there to educate on how to belong. It is there to educate with the course you are there to study. Everything else is on you. And as far as when people are asked to speak somewhere, if someone like Milo is asked to speak at a college campus, someone you regard to be a Nazi, then if we are to obey the words of Ulrich Bear, we must find his absolute opposite and invite them to speak too. I would assume that to be you.
Bear also points out how the abilities of folks in marginalized groups, for instance, trans people, people of color, undocumented immigrants, and the list goes on, have been attacked and undermined by others in the name of freedom of speech.
That particular statement that I've picked there is quite open to interpretation, and obviously when you say attacked, that is in itself subjective. You could have a comedian making a joke about someone who is trans. They are a comedian, they're trying to make that crowd laugh, but somebody's going to get offended. That said, I am not going to now condone attacks on trans people or people of colour, but words are words.
And that reminds me, as many things in this discussion often do, of the paradox of tolerance, which is something that I have spoken about in videos before, and a lot of you already know what it is, but just in case you haven't heard of the paradox of tolerance, it was stated most famously by Karl Popper, who said that if you want a truly tolerant society, the one thing you must not be tolerant of is intolerance.
Surely by that logic, then, it is intolerant to not allow someone to speak just because you don't want to hear what they have to say, even if it has already been said before, implying that anyone left on this planet has an original thought anyway, which no one does, let's face it. Everything's been said before. I'm surprised we haven't evolved to using telepathy. Well, you guys, you humans, you filthy pink skins, and other colour skins, but I'm focusing on the pink skins. I mean, let's face it, they're the white ones after all.
The paradox is there can be no such thing as perfect tolerance. Because if you are tolerant of everything, including intolerance, then ultimately intolerance will take over. The intolerant will impose their will on the tolerant, and you will wind up with a final product of an intolerant society, which was allowed to happen in the name of tolerance.
Sounds like a prerequisite to World War III, then. The tolerant versus the intolerant. Sarcasm aside, that particular paradox term makes me think a lot harder about the recent council elections in my country. Labour were demolished, so were UKIP in fact. Then again, UKIP have no real purpose anymore. Labour was supposed to be the real opposition, and look at them.
See, a lot of folks in the atheist and skeptical community especially believe that when they are defending the rights of awful people like Spencer or Yiannopoulos, or awful groups like neo-Nazi groups or the Ku Klux Klan or other white supremacist or white nationalist groups to speak, that they are doing something good, that they're defending the principle of freedom of speech. And they think, well, I have to defend freedom of speech for people like that because I want to preserve it for people like me and for other people.
You've just shown your hand. You focus solely on white people. They are the only bad people that shouldn't be allowed to speak. There are quite a number of other supremacist movements that exist in your country and around the world, and they get to speak because... I would do a drum roll. This is all I've got. They have free speech. And because idiots like you would defend their right to speak, even though what they have to say could be easily regarded as just as cancerous as what people like Spencer and Yiannopoulos have to say.
And that's a wonderful idea, and that's a wonderful concept, and it's a wonderful principle, but I don't think that it translates to real life perfectly.
Nor could it ever be, because societal perfection is impossible.
I think that if you truly care about freedom of speech, and the situation you want to see realized is the maximum number of people able to exercise their freedom of speech in our society,
then you don't do what Steve Shives suggests and instead allow everyone to speak because they have a constitutional right to do so.
Able to participate in political conversations, especially in ways that will be recognized and valued. And if you particularly would like to see this happen for groups of people who have been historically disenfranchised, who have been historically ignored or silenced or erased, whose contributions and ideas and voices have not been valued.
Is it wrong that I find it fascinating that sometimes people use the historical oppression argument and other times they'll use the current year argument? Personally, I treat everyone equally regardless. So until 2020, when I kill every last one of you, you all get freedom of speech. Now, I don't like the idea of using historical oppression as an argument because it means I now have to look at someone whose ancestors were oppressed. I would much rather treat that person as they are now, because then they aren't carrying the burden of their ancestors. And I'm not trying to take away from what their ancestors went through, or what they themselves may still feel the side effects of, but I will treat people equally regardless.
Then I don't see how you can justify choosing to defend neo-Nazis and people like Richard Spencer and people like Milo Yiannopoulos when they are protested, when their events are shut down by students at those colleges who have simply had enough and refuse to allow people like that to use their microphones and their stages and their venues to speak to their audience and spread their hatred and intolerance.
Quite a large part of me is convinced not one of those protesters knows what they're protesting against. I think they're just turning up because they're bored and they've run out of beer, and because they're told rape culture's a thing so they're not having sex.
If you believe in freedom of speech, you should be on the side of the protesters. You should be not defending the rights of people like Spencer and Yiannopoulos and others like that.
I think there's a difference between protesting and speaking, because some of those protests, certainly ones related to Yiannopoulos and Spencer, have devolved into violence. Peaceful protesting is absolutely fine, and if protests go through certain planning permission, it's fine, because they speak at those, well, quite a number of them do, they speak at their protests. And that's fine. I see no problem with protests, as long as they're done correctly, legally. If any laws exist that apply to them, we have them in the UK, I don't know if you do in the US. And I'm not defending the views of the people that speak that you don't like because of what they think. I'm defending their right to speak because they have the right to speak. I defend everyone's right to speak regardless.
This is not an easy issue because we are human beings, we are imperfect, and there will never be a perfect system for determining who it is best to listen to and platform and who it is best to ignore.
Until 2020, when I end every last one of your miserable lives, and I might save some of you for the sandwich mine. Now go away, buy my shirts, donate to my Patreon, blah blah blah, shameless promotion, and have a lovely day.